welcome to AP on Play. I am your host, Anjali Prasad, and we have with us this morning Dean Elaine Carey from Oakland University. Good morning, Dean.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. I wanted to feature you in part because I wanted to do some featuring of Oakland University, kind of a hidden gem in our community. But let's first start with your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name's Elaine Carey, and I started as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences at Oakland University in 2021, so in the midst of COVID. And prior to that, I was a dean in the Purdue system, and then I'm also a Latin American historian, and I spent most of my career in New York City.
So let's start with Oakland University. How big is the university?
So we are currently a little bit less than 16,000 students. That includes both graduate and undergraduate students for this academic year.
And how are you guys able to attract? Are you students mostly from in-state, and how are you able to attract students?
Yes, the majority of students are from in-state. They're also from the three surrounding counties, predominantly. We have students from other parts of the state, as well as international students, and students from out of state, too.
Do you do any on-campus recruiting?
Yes, we do. Actually, this Saturday, we have Go for the Gold. So if anyone's interested and they have a student who is considering going to college, please come. It's on Saturday morning. It begins on Saturday morning, but goes to the afternoon.
Where do they go?
They go to the Oakland Center at Oakland University. They can also go on the website and register online.
Okay. And so what is it? What kind of event is this?
It introduces students and parents to the university. So there are tours, their faculty will talk about particular degrees, whether within the College of Arts and Sciences or the other schools, so business, engineering, nursing, health sciences, education, and human services. So as well as student services will be there to answer any questions, admissions, financial aid, as well as other student support services will be available on Saturday.
Good. Go for the gold.
Go for the gold.
What is the undergraduate tuition there? Do you know?
It's on the website, and so, there's the tuition rate, but there's also a lot of funding opportunities.
Okay, super.
So I think, I think it's important for parents and students to go to something like Go for the Gold or to make an appointment with admissions and financial aid for a tour.
Yeah.
Because sometimes when you look at the tuition, you may think, oh, this isn't necessarily affordable for me. But the state of Michigan, as well as Oakland University, offers a lot of support. And so I think it's worth it to come to Go for the Gold, ask those questions, or to make an appointment with admissions, take a tour, get to know the university, and also see what other opportunities there are there.
I think you have an honors program, don't you?
Yes.
And I was hearing really good things about it. Can you tell us briefly what is the honors program?
Sure. We do have an honors college.
Yes.
And so students are admitted, they'll be admitted into the honors college as well as to their area, the college or the school of their discipline. And so part of that program is they work very closely with a faculty member or a couple of faculty members on undergraduate research. So it's an excellent program. The Honors College will also be available to answer any questions during Go for the Gold, but also parents and students can reach out to the dean and to the Honors College. His name's Graham Harper.
Doesn't Oakland University also have some kind of election division or election center? There's something to do with elections. I'm inartfully saying it, but I was reading about this. What is that?
It's the Center for Civic Engagement, it's led by Dr. David Dulio. He is a political scientist.
Okay, what is this?
And so the center hosts, especially during an election year, host debates. So this may be to bring speakers to campus, politicians to campus. Currently, at the end of October, Donna Brazil and Karl Rove will be on campus through the Center for Civic Engagement. So there are lecture series. There's also internal symposiums, so with faculty who have expertise in the area. So these events are open to the public, and you can find them on the center's website.
And I think there's only a handful of these centers for civic engagement in the United States. OU happens to be one of a few schools.
Yes. So they and so there is support for these centers. These are growing, and whether some have an approach on civic engagement, as this one does, where it has an outward looking, but also they're focused on voting, access to voting, and really participating in that. So there's a lot of ways to connect with it, and the events are open to the public.
Okay, very good. Tell us a little bit about your educational background, and then we can dive into some of the research and the writings that you've done.
Sure. So I have an undergraduate degree in international relations from Florida State University. And like many people who get degrees in international relations, I thought I would be an attorney too, and or a writer. I wasn't sure, and so I ended up pursuing a master's degree. Initially, that was at another university than where I finished, because I thought, well, I'll go into the Peace Corps. I was just killing time to go into the Peace Corps. And then I decided, well, actually, I'll finish that master's degree, and then I'll go into the Peace Corps. And then I ended up finishing my doctorate at the University of New Mexico in Latin American history. And then I was also affiliated with the Latin American Institute there.
Did you go to Peace Corps or no?
No, I never did. I never did. I deferred it, and then, I'll go after my master's degree,
right.
Or, I'll go after my PhD, and I never went. But I suggest it's a wonderful program for anyone who's interested in the Peace Corps.
Right. So you received your PhD in Latin American history.
Correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And tell us about some of the research that you've done, you're doing. Tell us about your projects.
So I began as a historian, a social historian, meaning I studied social movements, and particularly how they navigated state-sponsored terror. That was the subject of my first book, which is entitled Plaza of Sacrifices, Gender, Power, and Terror in 1968 Mexico. And I continued to write, and I do presentations on student movements and protest. But beginning around in the early 2000s, I started to build on research that I had started while I was working on my PhD. So I'm a Fulbright Fellow, and so I had one for my doctoral work, my field work. And during that time, while I was working at student movements, I started to read what would be literary criticism of William Burroughs, the beat writer from the U.S., who had repeating characters. And he had spent time in Mexico. He had been imprisoned in Lucumberry prison, where many Mexican political prisoners had been imprisoned, such as David Alvaro Siqueiros, the famous artist, as well as many students during '68. And so I just read literary criticism of him, and I realized that some of his repeating characters, particularly when he was writing about drugs, were real. And so I started to research particularly one woman he wrote about, which he named Lupe, Lupita, Lola, Lolita. And that woman was named Maria Dolores Esteves Zuleta, and she was the heroin boss of Mexico City.
In what time frame? What years?
From the 1930s until her death in the late 1950s.
Okay.
And so she controlled what initially seemed to be the Mexico City heroin trade, but it was far more than that. She had labs in northern Mexico, close to the U.S.-Mexico border. She was fabulously wealthy for that era. And so, for example, she was imprisoned on the island prison, Islas Marias, in Mexico. And there, she built her own airport. She would fly in her cosmetologist and hairdresser, as well as her daughters. And people would visit her on that island prison, including one judge who had put her in there, but then asked to have favors from her. So she was essentially an organized crime boss in the 1930s.
How did she rise to power?
Her mother had been a street vendor, so women dominate the informal economic sector, meaning they dominate street vending. They dominate whether it's street vending of food or alcohol, and as well as other areas of street vending. And her mother had been a street vendor who initially sold coffee and chicharron, or coffee and pork rind, and then she shifted to selling morphine and marijuana. And of course, the latter was far more lucrative. Mm-hmm. And her daughter, Maria Dolores, who went by Lola, was her mule throughout Mexico City. So as a child, she began to understand that trade. Mm-hmm. So she was illiterate, but she understood the economics of street marketing and how to grow it, and she did. So her mother brought her into the trade, which is not uncommon.
So this is somebody who lived in the what years?
She was born at the turn of the century, mm-hmm. and then she died in the late 1950s.
Okay. And at the time she was, well, let's fast forward now. Your studies and your research have led you to prominent females in the drug communities in Mexico, correct?
Yes, and in the hemisphere.
Yeah,
yes.
So let's talk about that. What we were talking about earlier was when I was a drug prosecutor, I often was left to prosecute females who are on the low level of the drug trade, the mules and the couriers. But your research and your investigation has led you to uncover women in power in the drug trade. So let's tell the viewers a little bit about that.
Sure. So drug trafficking is part of organized crime. So it's highly structured. It has a hierarchy. And it also has specializations. So a courier is at the low end, a mule or is at the low end of that specialization. And in fact, it's not really a specialization because you're recruited and brought in, and there may be threats that are involved in that recruitment. But so specialization is obviously production. So the growing of whether it's poppy or marijuana, the processing, and then the internal logistics and movement, then the smuggling, then the external distribution, as well as to the sale. So for somebody like Lola Chata, who I mentioned, she specialized, she was not in production. She was a urban person. So instead, what she focused on in her specialization was processing and internal logistics to the U.S.-Mexico border, and then guaranteeing, which many groups did, a guarantee on the other side of the border. And then another organized crime group would then move the drugs internally in the United States to a selling point. So that meant going to Houston, going to Los Angeles, making its way to states such as Chicago, Detroit, New York. Mm-hmm. So this is beginning in the 30s and 40s. So currently what we see is women have, so that's an older model, right? She's specializing in processing internal logistics. Over time, it becomes more sophisticated. And so currently, women will be involved in all areas, production, and historically, women have also been involved in the growing of poppy or marijuana, processing, so women who are trained chemists.
How do we go, hang on,
yeah.
Since you mentioned poppy, so explain to us how we go from the growing of the poppy seed, right?
Mm-hmm, growing of the poppy in the pod.
Okay, so take us from the manufacturing of the poppy to the heroin.
So the poppy will be harvested and the gum, and then it will be processed. So it's grown on fields. A woman may control those fields or a man. It depends because it's usually a familial business. It's whoever shows the most competence is recruited. So this idea that, Mexico is a macho culture and it'll always be a man is not true. It could be a woman. So it is harvested frequently by women. The gum is harvested by women, but not necessarily, but a lot of women work in that area of the production. And then it is processed in labs. Historically, those labs are staffed by chemists, people in some cases who have advanced degrees in chemistry. So they are brought in for a period of time after the harvest for processing. Once it is processed, then the logistics begin. So those early stages are less lucrative. So if it's a vertical business, right? So the more stages you control, the more wealth you will be able to have. So it's rare you can be a producer and be, all the way up that vertical line, but not necessarily. So where the money is more made, obviously, is the distribution to the other side of the border for sale. And so that's, and then of course there will be other distribution points. So that is where more of the money is made. Mm-hmm. So, and there's a hierarchy. So somebody who's a poppy grower in production, it's far more lucrative than somebody who is in the marijuana side. And that's a historical continuity. It continues. It's not just now. Right.
The poppy grower, generally speaking, is the poppy grower is the poppy going to legitimate places as well, or is it exclusively grown for the heroin?
So,
in other words,
do you mean like pharmaceutical industry?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but most of it is illicit. Mm-hmm. But there is a very strong pharmaceutical industry internally within Mexico, just like in the United States, mm-hmm. And that is, controlled. In this case, this is illicit poppy that is being produced, and for distribution to the United States, Canada, and other locations.
So explain to our viewers, now we have, the poppy has been manufactured and it's now been produced into the heroin, correct? Mm-hmm. In Mexico, maybe on a Mexican farm?
It could be in a farm, it could be in a lab. It may actually
okay.
be moved to another location. It might be it might be processed on the farm if the farm is robust enough to have a lab. Or it could be actually moved to another location, transported, moved for processing, then moved closer to the U.S.-Mexico border, or to an airport, because it's not, or to a dock. Because we usually think it's being driven across, but It's being driven across. It's coming on ships, and it's also coming through planes. So but if you can get a carload through a controlled space, such as through a border crossing, you have a better chance of bringing that smuggler, that mule, has a better chance of bringing in more product than if somebody is having it on their persons or in their luggage.
So once we have the mule somehow cross the border, and in a few minutes I want to ask you about the apprehension of the drugs that come across the border, but somebody manages to get it across the border in a truck, then where does it go? How does it work?
So historically, especially for a state like Michigan, there was an organization in Chicago that was part of what would be, and if anyone has watched Narcos Mexico, you're familiar with this, what is the Guadalajara organization. Mm-hmm. And this organization, the Herrera Drug Trafficking Organization, it was folded into the Sinaloa organization that exists today. But historically, from the 1950s, trucks and cars would drive, so there would be smugglers who would drive loads of heroin to Chicago. What was interesting about the Herrera organization is they distributed to everybody, absolutely everybody. So they worked with other organized crime groups. They worked with gangs. So that could be African-American gangs, Latino gangs, outlaw motorcycle gangs. They distributed to everybody. They weren't going into people's communities. It was people who were from those communities were receiving the drugs from this particular organization, including here in Detroit. So in the 1970s and 80s, there would be Asian heroin that would come in through the airport, come in from Canada, but 70% of it would have been coming from the U.S.-Mexico border via Chicago.
Mm. Is it even possible to apprehend all of the drugs that are crossing the border, in your opinion, based on your research?
No. We're now in the 51st year of the war on drugs, which was declared by former President Nixon, and the formation of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And the revenue keeps growing. So it is difficult. I think and as you know, whether it's policing agents and whether they're in the federal government or the state government, and what they will say, and they have historically said this, so this is not just, I hear it now, but I read it in documents from 100 years ago, that they're always 10 steps ahead of us because of the amount of resources that they have access to. And so that makes it, and the technological advances have made it even at times more difficult because they can use things like
what?
Satellite phones, dark net, dark web.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So encrypted messaging services. So you're not using beepers or which makes it more difficult to police that. It doesn't mean that we don't have folks who have all that training and are as capable. It's just the level and the amount of flows and people involved that makes it difficult.
How can we ever get ahead of it?
I think, some of that is ways of which we want to think about how do we control demand.
How do we? I'm asking you as a prosecutor and a criminal defense attorney, how can we control demand at this point?
And that's the question. I mean, we've had some really great over time, we've had, under certain administrations and in certain states, some great initiatives to stem demand.
Like what?
Oh, some of them have been, we know from Ronald Reagan, just say no.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So,
Which I was a kid, but it seemed like that had some limited success.
Right. This is your brain.
Yes.
This is your brain on drugs. People probably remember that. The after-school
yes.
specials, which came kind of out of the Nixon and Carter administration.
Yes, right.
So we remember those.
Yeah.
I mean, I still remember those vividly.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes we've seen those kind of national efforts. Sometimes where we've seen states that have really invested into rehab centers.
Is Michigan one of those states?
Michigan has it, but I think it's increasing because of the need is increasing. There are never enough beds. And I think that's part of, so how do we, and also it's difficult, right, to bring somebody successfully through rehabilitation. Mm-hmm. It's usually not just a one-off. It's multiple times, especially somebody who has been a user for many, many years. So there also has to be a change in how we think about somebody's addiction and the user themselves.
Yes, and this, I agree with you. The courts, it's changing a little now, but historically the court system has punished addicts and incarcerated addicts. And only in the last few years are we seeing this shift toward rehabilitation. Now, they're still getting incarcerated by and large, but they're being provided rehabilitative services in prison. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think that's where we should be. I think we should be full-blown, forget about incarceration for the addicts, mm-hmm. and get them in full-blown rehabilitation, because I think you're limited in how much you can rehabilitate in a prison setting.
Right, and I agree. I visited a sheriff in a small town in Indiana, and I saw a video he did where he was talking about that the drugs in our community are being brought by and sold by people who are from our community, right? These aren't folks from the outside. These are folks who live here. They are part of the fabric of our community. So I went to go meet him, and he gave me a tour of his jail, and I asked him, just how many of his cases were predominantly drug cases, with users, and that was the majority. And so I did ask him about, so where do they detox?
Yes.
And he said, you know what it's going to look like. And I knew, and he said, I would love to be able to have a social worker or a counselor with a specialty in addiction here. I would love to be able to have more support so that folks could go through detox in more of a clinical setting than a padded cell.
Clinical setting, that's what I was looking for.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
So, I think, there are a lot of these conversations that are going on. And I think you're right. It's going to take a change in the mindset, but it also is resources because there aren't enough beds. And we all have to recognize that it isn't just going to be a one-off for somebody.
Right, right. We have a few more minutes. Elaine, I wanted to have you talk about marijuana for a little bit. Tell us what's the status of marijuana here in Michigan, and how does marijuana tie into this bigger drug trade stemming from Mexico?
So marijuana is legal in Michigan. It had bipartisan support, which makes Michigan a little more unique than, say, a state like, say, California or New York or Colorado, and some of the other states that were that had legalization movements a little bit earlier.
Now here it's completely legal? Is that?
Cannabis is it is legal. It's controlled.
Okay.
There are lots of controls that are in place. I'm not in that industry, but
Well, we know,
so it has to be grown here. You have to buy it from a dispensary.
Yeah.
There is still illicit marijuana that is in the state of Michigan. So it's just like you will have illicit cigarettes, right? Cigarettes are legal. You'll still have, it's one of the huge kind of commodity, illicit commodities that are sold are cigarettes, but also marijuana. It will still continue. So within the impact of legalization in the United States altered the drug trade from Mexico to the U.S. One thing that's important is marijuana is not indigenous to Mexico. It was brought to Mexico, so it's not from Mexico.
It was brought from where?
And the Spanish brought it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so then it would begin to be grown, but it's not. It's if we're thinking about trade and stuff, it was not. It's not indigenous, nor is poppy. So marijuana became associated in part because the biodiversity of Mexico. Just about any plant grows well because it's one of the most biodiverse countries. Well, marijuana was the predominant commodity. It was the predominant revenue-generating commodity for drug traffickers and illicit crime because
In what years are we talking now?
Up until quite recently.
Yes,
up
okay,
until
that's
the
what I
end.
thought, yes.
Because there are far more marijuana users than there are heroin users or even cocaine users. And so when there's legalization, marijuana sales begin to collapse. Not collapse, but they're not as lucrative, right? They're declining rapidly. And so what we see, some of that has been replaced because of what we've seen in the news about overprescribing of opioids and things like that in the early part of the century, creating more users. So what happened is there was a greater escalation of the production of opioids. And so that kind of offset that decline in sales. So marijuana is also legal in many places in Mexico, but that is kind of the impact, I think, is, if an organization relied heavily on marijuana as part of their revenue, they looked for other sources.
So in your opinion, the legalization of marijuana in the United States just drove up the manufacturing of other illicit drugs?
I don't know if it drove it up at the same level, because if we also look at, there's a decline in the demand of marijuana because of medicinal marijuana legalization. At the same time, we had the over-prescribing in the U.S. of narcotics.
Right.
So, and then the changes in prescribing led to other people looking for other sources. So they're happening at the same time, they're not necessarily related.
Okay. Fentanyl. Let's have a quick talk on fentanyl. We have maybe
Sure.
1 minute left. Tell us about what your research has yielded on this drug.
So fentanyl, the area that fentanyl comes into, the precursors to make it come into a port, a natural port in Mazatlan, as well as others along the Pacific coast. So this is a trade that is overseen in part of Mexican organized crime working with Chinese organized crime, bringing the precursor chemicals into Mexico where they are processed.
What are the precursor chemicals?
You know, I'm not a chemist, and I'm not as
Yeah.
comfortable to say because I just don't remember all of them offhand.
But the chemicals come in and then they're manufactured in Mexico.
They're processed,
Or
and then,
processed,
they're processed in Mexico, usually mixed in, and then with heroin, and then brought across the border. So now there have been conversations about of Mexican organized crime saying they don't want to be in the business anymore, and we'll see if that happens. But
Because why?
Because one, the negative attention from the DEA and from the U.S. government, as well as the Mexican government, but also you can't control where it goes, and it's going into Mexico too. So,
Interesting.
yeah,
Wow. To be continued.
to be continued.
Well, Elaine, thank you so much for coming in. My idea was to educate the viewers a little bit on the drug trade and really how it gets to Detroit and what we can do about it. You've obviously done a lot of research on this issue. Happy to have you here at Oakland University and happy to have you come in this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning into AP on Play today. I am your host, Anjali Prasad, and I will see you next time.